I'm here with Kristiina Brunila, Professor of Sociology and Education at the University of Helsinki. Kristiina has done a lot of research in the area of social justice education. Thank you very much, Kristiina, for joining me today for this conversation. My first question is about the significance of policy for socially just and equitable education.
Well, it's a good way to start with our friend policy. I have studied educational and transsectoral, national and transnational policies and practices nearly 20 years. Oh, I'm getting old. With our research group and in our research center. And I would say that from our research perspective, we seem to be in this enormous loop where policies produce the problems they aim to overcome. For example, when policies aim to tackle various kinds of inequalities, they attach themselves with ideologies and knowledge systems that just end up reproducing inequalities. And it's a very typical thing in policy to address inequalities from a rather individualized perspective, where these individuals, like children, young people, adults, students, and so on, are considered to lack cultural and societal connections. And they are just considered as individuals who are considered to lack specific very predetermined competencies and skills, which policy then shifts into questions in education to address. And so education becomes what we call as enabling, providing these specific skills and competencies which narrow the focus enormously and unfortunately ends up reproducing inequalities. And one sad thing is that I've noticed that in many cases policymakers have decided not to listen to researchers, or they listen to researchers very, very selectively. They listen to those who they like, and it shows. And what policymakers seem to be lacking is what I usually call as societal literacy and power literacy. The understanding of what is going on in a society, both locally and globally, and how that shapes education, how it shapes knowledge, as well as what we think of children and young people, for example. So policy is, to answer your question, policy is significant, but more in terms of producing problems rather than helping to overcome, which of course keeps us researchers very, very busy.
And what are some of the most pressing challenges for socially just and equitable education that have emerged from your own line of research?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, the focus of education, as well as the idea of a child, a young person, and so on, is narrowing. And that I am quite concerned about. And we see this in policies and educational and training practices all the time. And nowadays, the ideal in education seems to be this very employable, self-responsible, entrepreneurial child, young person and adult. Someone who is very, very self-responsible and who turns inward to look both for problems and their solutions. And that, I think, is quite sad. It's also a little bit like going back to Thatcherism. You remember Margaret Thatcher? To think that there are only individuals and families, and that's it. And I know many scholars who do not understand what a societal structure is, or what a power relation is, or they might maybe recognize these things, but they do not belong. But they think that these things do not belong to their research or teaching in any way. Then, if I look at Nordic education and especially Finland, I would say our major problem is ignorance, or should I even say arrogance. We have got used to thinking that our education is so fine, although we have so many problems in our system, and especially in terms of inequalities, but that we refuse to look at because of ignorance and because we think that we are so fine. So if you ever hear someone saying Finland's educational system is so fine, just do not believe it like that. Ask this person about racism and racialization in our educational system. Ask why our system is one of the most segregated by gender. Ask about homophobia and heteronormativity. Ask about all those forms of violence, harassment, and bullying that are taking place. Ask about these multiple inequalities that our research has shown for decades. And ask about the lack of research and research-based teaching related to equality and diversity.
And what are some of the insights from your own research in the context of Finnish education that might bear relevance to Australian education?
Well, first of all, these terms, Finnish education and Australian education, they're quite huge. But in a more general way, I would like to address all Australians who are watching this to be much more critical towards looking at Finland as a model country of education or equality or anything. As someone who has been studying problems related to inequalities, like I told, nearly 20 years, I can confirm we have problems. What I have learned myself when studying inequality problems related to education, if you want to make your educational system better, I would suggest to think first what you mean by better and where it derives from. What is the ideology behind the better? Is it economic competition and management, or is it something else? If it's something else, is it about caring that all children and young people from different backgrounds and circumstances would receive the best possible societal, cultural, historical, philosophical, ethical, environmental, and critical understanding of the world, and how it can be changed towards more equal and fair? So do not look at Finland as a model or any other country. Just listen to your best sociologists, historians, philosophers, humanists, feminist thinkers. Also listen to artists, writers, other intellectuals, and listen to children and young people. They have a lot to say. And most importantly, I cannot say this enough, do not panic about PISA or other problematic performative rankings. The PISA and others, they have an ideology of their own, and you do not need that ideology. As a matter of fact, that ideology keeps ruining our educational system, and we should stop listening to these rankings.
And finally, what role do you think educators can play in addressing some of the inequities that exist in education and society at large?
Well, education, I think, is in a very crucial position, both in terms of producing and overcoming problems of inequalities. But I don't think that we seem to understand this yet very well, at least. Instead, we seem to be educating children and young people and adults towards serving the economy, and something that is unsustainable and unfair. We are all political actors who are affiliated in education, who work in education, and education is always political, whether you like it or not. It is always political. So if we would acknowledge this, then we could start to think and recognize whether there are problems in the political, and if so, what can we do otherwise? So we should, in a way, we should bring political back into education.
Thank you very much, Kristiina. It has been a great pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you.